This video is for general educational purposes only and reflects our experience of UK tax and HMRC matters. It is not tax advice, and professional advice should be taken for your specific circumstances. Hello, my name is Comfort Iore. I'm a co-founder of C&B Partners Limited.
Hello, my name is Brian Duckren and I'm a co-founder of C&B Partners Limited, and welcome to Tax Chats. Sounds like SOLs is the department in HMRC that effectively checks its homework before it goes to court.
Absolutely, absolutely. By the time it gets to SOLs, that means we are working towards defending the case at tribunal.
I think people will have heard of tribunals, probably employment or industrial tribunals. In this setting, what is a tribunal? What goes on there?
The tax tribunal is actually relaxed compared to the employment tribunal or compared to an industrial tribunal. The judges ensure that the individuals who come in, because some of them are agents with no legal background, some of them are just lay persons like taxpayers like you and I who would go there and want to defend our case. The judges just ensure that the environment is calm, it's easy, and that people don't feel too pressured.
Hello and welcome to Tax Chats with C&B Partners Limited. We are a tax consultancy and advisory firm. We are both ex-HMRC inspectors with a combined experience of 50 years. My name is Comfort Iore. I am a tax specialist and tax solicitor.
Hi, my name is Brian Duckren. I'm also a former HMRC officer, worked across HMRC for many decades, dealing with collection, recovery, tax investigation, and providing tactical advice to inquiry officers. And hopefully we can draw on our experience and help you to understand why HMRC does things that it does and the way it operates.
In this episode, we're going to be talking about the Solicitors Office and Legal Services, also known as SOLs.
Right. So one of the questions I would like to know is, who works in SOLs and what do SOLs do?
Before I go into that, I'm going to tell you what SOLs is.
Okay.
So the Solicitors Office and Legal Services is a legal department within HMRC.
Okay.
They handle all legal services for HMRC. I worked in SOLs for 8 years. And within that 8 years, I spent 5 years going to tribunals as a litigator.
Wow. So what do SOLs do and how they handle reviews?
Okay. By the time a case gets to SOLs, it must have already gone through inquiries. So when HMRC opens an inquiry, it means that they're looking to get some information from you, that they have questions that need to be answered. So when a caseworker makes a decision and you do not agree with that decision, you have the right to submit an appeal. And that's what we call statutory review. You're asking for them to review that decision that was made by the caseworker. And that's when it goes to SOLs, because SOLs is responsible for doing the review. So you usually have tax specialists who conduct the review. They also work with the caseworker who would have made that decision, the previous decision, as well as with anyone else who would have been involved in the decision making. So, for example, in one of the cases I worked with, we had to get not just the caseworker, so the initial decision maker, but we also had to involve third parties, like a translator or like someone who has information regarding the specific area that we're investigating. So because when you are reviewing a case, you want to make sure that the decision that was made before can be justified, because the whole point of doing the review is to see whether the initial decision was correct. And we don't want to get to the tribunal and then realize that that decision was incorrect. So we involve all the relevant parties. So there could be lawyers, it could be caseworkers, it could just be the tax specialist who goes and reviews the initial decision. So within SOLs, you have different people working together. So for example, paralegals, I was once a paralegal before I became a tax solicitor. And a lot of the work that I did then was to review the previous decision and to consider any aspect of that decision that may be challenged if we get to the tribunal.
So to be clear, it sounds like SOLs is the department in HMRC that effectively checks its homework before it goes to court. Is that right?
Absolutely, absolutely. By the time it gets to SOLs, that means we are working towards defending the case at tribunal.
Right.
So when we're doing that review, the statutory review, we're ensuring that when we finally write our statement of case, the statement of case is what goes to the tribunal. We are saying we've looked at all the areas, we've considered the legislation, we've considered the evidence, and we are confident that this will hold in a tribunal. It's not always the case that it holds, because obviously by the time it gets to tribunal, you may have new evidence that comes up, or you may have something that we never considered or that wasn't disclosed to us when we were doing the statutory review.
You mentioned tribunal. Would you just explain to us what tribunal is? I think people will have heard of tribunals, probably employment or industrial tribunals. In this setting, what is a tribunal? What goes on there?
The way the tribunal is set, you have a main judge who makes the decision, but you also have two lay persons who, one of them could be a judge, but usually there are two people who have experience in tax or accountancy. So they inform the decision that's being made. The judge consults with them, but ultimately the judge makes the decision. And the tax tribunal is actually relaxed compared to the employment tribunal or compared to an industrial tribunal. The judges ensure that the individuals who come in, because some of them are agents with no legal background. Some of them are just lay persons, like taxpayers, like you and I, who would go there and want to defend our case. The judges just ensure that the environment is calm, it's easy, and that people don't feel too pressured. Because as you know, litigation can be very difficult and intense. So, but when you get to the tax tribunal, you realize that it's not that intense at all. The judges do break things down for the ordinary person.
So is there a deadline for a taxpayer in order to sort of get to a tribunal stage when they're in there? Because at this point, one assumes that if you get into the stage of a tribunal, you've gone through a lot of stages with dealing with HMRC. At this point, you've been fighting HMRC all this point, and you have decided that you are right and you are going to go. Is there a deadline by which you've got to do that? Is the clock ticking?
Yes, there is. So by the time the initial decision has been made and you're not happy with it, and you put in what we know as statutory review, when you notify HMRC that you're appealing their initial decision, you have the right to notify the tribunal as well to say you want to appeal that decision.
Oh, okay.
And you can apply for the review within HMRC, within SOLs, like we talked about earlier, or you could go straight to the tribunal, and you have 30 days to do that. 30 days from the initial decision, or 30 days from when you receive the statutory review.
Okay. Can I appeal to the tribunal without having a statutory review?
Absolutely. You can. And a lot of people who believe that HMRC's decision is not going to change, because it is often seen that HMRC double down on their initial decision, not because they want to, but because they believe that they have a strong case. Like I said, by the time it gets to SOLs and SOLs does the statutory review, they're going to look at the initial decision. If they think it makes legislative sense, or as we know, procedural sense, then HMRC is going to say we made a decision and we're standing by a decision. And that's why a lot of people go straight to the tribunal to notify the tribunal of their desire to appeal the decision. And then it starts the clock as well, because the process can be lengthy. So if you believe that the decision HMRC is going to make, it's not going to change by putting in a statutory review, it's often advised that you go straight to the tribunal.
Two quick questions. One, have you ever come across occasion where the statutory review has been taken and somebody talks about going to tribunal and HMRC has changed its decision and decided to accept the taxpayer's point of view? And secondly, if you are going to go to tribunal and there's a massive tax bill for you to pay, do you have to pay that tax bill before you go to tribunal?
That's very typical of you to ask me two questions in one. But yes, I'll take it in turns. So the first question is, yes, I have had experiences where taxpayers or their agents will apply for statutory review and then also notify the tribunal of
of their appeal. And in that case, it's not that because they've notified the tribunal that HMRC will want to change its decision. It's only if they've provided additional information that makes HMRC consider the initial decision to be false or weak or incomplete or incorrect. Would they consider that, okay, maybe we need to review a decision now so that we don't end up, because there's this notion that HMRC is risk adverse. If you've worked within HMRC, you know that if we're taking any case to the tribunal, we want to be confident that the case, we can support it by the time we get there. That's legislatively sound, that's procedurally sound, and just common sense sound, to be honest. So the aim is to conduct a statutory review that looks at every aspect of the initial decision, and then any additional evidence or any additional information that's been provided needs to be considered as well. But HMRC would never just change its decision because you apply to the tribunal, because it's just one of the many processes we have to review decisions by HMRC, but it does not in itself make HMRC reconsider the decision. The statutory review caseworkers or tax specialists, they are trained to conduct the review at a standard that's extremely high. So if they're saying that there's nothing here that tells them that the initial decision is incorrect, then it doesn't matter whether you decide to notify the tribunal of an appeal or not. But what is important here is that you have the chance to notify your appeal to the tribunal, because it gives you another platform to provide additional evidence or additional facts that you think HMRC may have overlooked.
And do I have to pay?
You do not have to pay to appeal to the tribunal, to notify the tribunal of your appeal. It's free. You just have to make sure that you do it on time.
Okay.
Because late appeal is frowned upon by the tribunal.
Okay.
Except you have a reasonable excuse.
Okay.
A reasonable excuse is not, for example, the fact that your accountant gave you bad advice, or that you think that you could have done it differently. An excuse would be if you're ill, seriously ill, and that you could not fulfill your tax responsibilities because of that illness, or someone passed away in your family and that severely affected your ability to conduct any activity, because the judges will look at your day-to-day activities and also just how soon you went about correcting whatever the issue was when you got better.
Okay.
But I have seen on one occasion when I ended up representing HMRC, and this lady came with her husband, and she had said multiple times that she had a reasonable excuse, but HMRC decision maker as well as the review officer didn't consider that the reasonable excuse was satisfactory, was enough, and therefore they did not agree and wanted her to pay. It was a late payment then. The case was a late payment, and she came to the tribunal. She brought in an extra doctor's record or note that stated the severity of her illness and how it affected her on a day-to-day. So even though from an outside perspective you would think, but it doesn't stop you from brushing your teeth or it doesn't stop you from eating, the tribunal took the view of the GP. I mean, her doctor knows best how her condition affects her, right?
Yeah.
So by the time she talked about how she struggled on a day-to-day, the judges were like, well, there's no reason here. This shouldn't constitute reasonable excuse.
Yeah.
And that case was literally
That sounds like an experience to me from the caseworker, because that would have been something I would have asked for, that kind of medical information. But just going back to the tribunal and the actual tax it said, I'm decided that I'm going to take my appeal to tribunal. I've got a tax bill to pay. Am I required to pay that tax bill before I get to tribunal, or is there some sort of mechanism that allows me to stay the payment for any reason at all?
That's a great question. So when you put in an appeal to HMRC and even to the tribunal, you can request as part of your appeal that the amount the disputed tax is put on hold, so it's postponed. This does is that you don't have to worry about that amount being due during the appeal process. But you have to remember that if it is found that that amount is due at the end of the tribunal dispute, if the tribunal finds that you owe that amount will accrue interest. So it will likely increase. So that's why I encourage taxpayers to get as much information in terms of how much interest will accrue if they do not, if they're not successful in their appeal.
Because that could sting you big time.
It could.
The advice would be is if you believe some element of the tax liability is due, pay what you think is due, and then ask for that difference, that amount that you're disputing to be put aside. But be mindful, if you do not successfully prove your case in a tribunal, that amount becomes payable plus all of the interest during the period when it was postponed. And that can really whack you.
Yes, a lot of taxpayers are caught unaware about that. But yes, if you know that you want to put your disputed tax on hold, you have to keep in mind that interest will also be due.
So going to tribunal is actually can be quite a risky situation if you're not careful and don't think it through. What kind of hearings do you have in tribunals? Do they just one type of hearing, or do you have different types of hearing at these tribunals?
The cases that come to tribunal are civil cases. So that means there aren't any criminal Cop 9 cases that come to the first year tribunal, because that would go with the magistrate's court, because that would be criminal. So in the first year tribunal, we have the first year tribunal deals with basic cases as well as complex cases. It does involve the amount of disputed tax. So the higher the amount, the likelihood it will be categorized as either standard or complex. We also have the upper tier tribunal that consider decisions that has already been made by the first year tribunal, but you do have the right to appeal. So the only time you can appeal a decision from the first year tribunal is if you think they've made an error in law. So if you think there's been they've wrongly interpreted the legislation, then you can definitely appeal, but you need to get permission from the first year tribunal in order to be able to appeal in the upper tier tribunal.
Really?
Yes. It is always advised to get permission from the first year tribunal, and sometimes the first year tribunal could reject that.
I was just going to say.
They could say, oh, well, we do not think we've made any error in law. But then you could then appeal to the upper tier tribunal.
Why would the first year tribunal, the way I would look at it, if I was a tribunal judge and I'd made a decision and somebody said, well, I think you've made a mistake in law, I'm not particularly keen on you criticising me. Why would the first tribunal agree to a request to go to the upper tribunal? Why would they do that?
So first thing to keep in mind is that these judges are there to serve the community. They are there to make decisions that are just and fair. So if you made a decision that I believe is unjust on the grounds of law, for example, you've made an error in your interpretation of the law, it is right for me to say, I think you've made an error there. We're all humans. We're likely to make mistakes. And I've never met a judge in my experience that ever said, oh, I am above the law. I know everything. So judges are there to interpret the law based on precedents, so decisions that have been made by their predecessors, but also by just based on their understanding. That's why I talked about lay persons being part of the team, right? So that the decisions that they arrive at is as just as possible. But there have been times where, for example, the interpretation of the guidance, remember a lot of the guidance, HMRC guidance in general is backed up by law, right? So if your legislation, if you're interpreting the guidance and you've not interpreted it in the way that the legislation wanted it to be interpreted, you will find that the judges will sometimes, the upper tribunal judges will say, well, this was not the intention when this legislation was created. You've interpreted it this way, but however, I believe there's another interpretation that should have been considered here.
And that's one of the biggest issues I sometimes would find with caseworkers. HMRC guidance is written in a way when caseworkers are looking at it that it can fool them as thinking that's the law, and
Yes.
it isn't. It's HMRC's interpretation
Correct.
of the law, and HMRC has said that they are not the bastions and the guardians on tax law. They have interpreted and they've applied the rules and the application of the tax administration system as best as they see.
Yes.
And until somebody queries that and it's tested,
Yes.
they don't really know. And sometimes you will find, as you will agree, HMRC is happy to go to tribunal because there is a point of law that needs to be answered. They don't have the answer.
That's right.
Taxpayer doesn't have the answer. So we go to the courts, and the courts make the final arbitration for us on that point.
I
And
agree.
hopefully everybody's straight there.
I agree.
Well, thanks very much for that, Comfort.
Thank
that
you.
was great.
Thank you, Brian.
I really enjoyed it. And thank you for watching. So don't forget to like and subscribe and leave your comments below. Bye.